A little girl said her bed was shaking. The next night she was floating in the air. Police witnessed furniture moving on its own. Journalists ran out of the house screaming in fear, and when investigators asked what was happening, a deep, rasping voice answered from the mouth of a child, "My name is Bill. I died in this house. This is not a movie script, it actually happened. Welcome to the most terrifying and well-documented haunting in modern history, their Enfield Poltergeist. A true story told you. If you believe ghosts aren't real, it is only because you haven't heard this story yet." 1977, Enfield, North London. It was a warm August evening when Peggy Hodgson, a single mother of 4, tucked her children into bed. The air inside their humble council house on 284 Green Street felt unusually heavy that night. But after another long day of school runs and managing chores, Peggy was too tired to notice anything out of the ordinary until she heard it. A sharp, deliberate knock echoing through the walls of her children's bedroom. She rushed upstairs. Her 2 daughters, Margaret and Janet, were sitting up, pale and frightened. "Mom," Janet whispered. "The chest of drawers, it moved." Peggy frowned. "Moved by itself?" The girls nodded. She glanced at the heavy wooden chest against the wall. It hadn't budged an inch. But just as she turned to reassure them, a sudden scraping noise made her heart freeze. Before her eyes, the heavy chest slid across the floor, seemingly of its own accord. It slammed against the bedroom door. When Peggy tried to push it back, it wouldn't move, as if an unseen force was holding it down. Then came the knocks, again, this time louder, faster, as if something was trying to get out. That was the first night the Hodgson family realized something had entered their home, and it wasn't going to leave. Peggy grabbed her children and ran to the neighbor's house in terror. Over the coming weeks, she would come to understand that this was just the beginning. The night after the first strange incident, Peggy Hodgson sat awake, barely blinking, listening for any sound in the stillness of her Enfield home. Just past 2 a.m., the silence shattered again. Sharp, deliberate knocks echoed first from the ceiling, then from behind the furniture, and finally from the floor itself. It was as if something was crawling inside the very structure of the house. Her children cried out from their bedroom. Rushing in, Peggy found Janet tangled in her sheets, as though something had tried to drag her from the bed. The wardrobe doors creaked open and shut repeatedly, untouched by human hands. By the 3rd night, the entire family was sleeping in the same room, terrified. The lights were left on. Crucifixes were hung on the walls, but nothing stopped the chaos. Toys hurled themselves across the room. A Bible was discovered torn straight down the middle. The family dog barked madly and refused to go near the children's room. And then came the whispers low, hoarse murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. "You can't stay here," it said one night, the voice unmistakably male, bitter and angry, desperate. Peggy called in the neighbors Vic and Peggy Nottingham. They arrived skeptical until they heard it for themselves. While they stood in the hallway, a heavy iron fireplace in the children's room suddenly wrenched from the wall and crashed to the floor. Vic, a builder by trade, stood stunned. This wasn't natural. He would later tell reporters it just came off on its own. Still searching for help, Peggy contacted the police. Constable Caroline Heaps arrived and witnessed something no officer should ever have to explain. A chair slid across the living room floor and it so nearly 5 feet. No one was near it. She filed an official report confirming what she saw, but the authorities had no answers. No help came. The house was no longer just haunted, it was alive. And whatever was inside, it wasn't going to let the Hodgson family sleep in peace again. As the days passed, the Enfield house began to feel less like a home and more like a trap. The knocking had become routine, happening every night, almost like a sinister clock ticking through the darkness. But now, it was no longer just knocks or moving furniture. Something new had begun, something far more disturbing. It started with Janet. One morning, she sat silently at the kitchen table, her eyes distant, her face pale. When her mother asked what was wrong, she whispered, "He talks to me." Peggy didn't understand. "Who?" she asked. Janet looked up, her voice barely audible. "The man in the wall." At first, Peggy thought it was stress or imagination, but then others began to hear it too. Gravelly voice echoed through the house at random times, especially at night. It came from the walls, the corners, sometimes even from inside the furniture. The voice was sometimes angry, other times mocking. It would growl Janet's name. It would call out threats. Sometimes it laughed, but most horrifying of all, it began to speak through Janet herself. One night, as the family and neighbors sat in the living room, Janet suddenly froze. Her body stiffened. Her mouth opened, and from it came a voice that wasn't hers. It was old, cracked, male. It rasped. "Just leave me alone. This is my house." The voice went on, claiming to be a man named Bill who had died in a house years ago. His tone was bitter, resentful, and terrifyingly intelligent. He answered questions with details. Number 11-year-old could not date, even memories from before the Hodgsons had moved in. Over the next few nights, the voice became a regular presence, often speaking for hours through Janine. Investigators would later record over 200 hours of these sessions. Sometimes she spoke as Bill, sometimes as others. At times, multiple voices came from her at once. Doctors and psychologists examined her. She was tested for trickery, ventriloquism, even monitored during sleep, but nothing explained it. When Janet was unconscious or alone, the voices still came. When she was separated from her siblings, the activity continued. Whatever had entered their home had now found its voice, and it was using Janet as its mouthpiece. Janet Hodgson was no longer the same child. Once bright, cheerful, and full of energy, she now moved like a shadow of herself, nervous, always watching something that no one else could see. At night, her voice would change. Her eyes would roll back. Her body would twist in unnatural ways. The strange entity had found its vessel, and it wasn't letting go. One night, Peggy found Janet curled up in the corner of her bedroom, her limbs stiff, her eyes open but unblinking. When she called out to her, Janet didn't answer. Instead, her mouth moved in a hoarse, angry voice growled from deep within her throat. "I told you, this is my house." It wasn't just possession, it was dominance. The entity was now showing its full control. Soon after, Janet began to have blackouts. She would lose hours of her day, only to be told by others what she had done, things she couldn't remember at all. Furniture would move while she stood nearby, completely unaware. Her siblings watched in horror as she was thrown from her bed or dragged across the carpet by an invisible force. More than once, she was found levitating, floating horizontally in the air, her arms spread like wings, her body stiff as a board. Investigators began to visit more frequently, documenting everything. They set up cameras and audio recorders. What they captured defied all logic: heavy objects moving on their own, loud crashing sounds with no source, and Janet's transformation into something unrecognizable. She was no longer simply being haunted, she was being consumed. The spirit spoke more openly now, identifying itself again as Bill Wilkins. He claimed he had died in the house years ago, blind and alone in a chair, after a brain hemorrhage. When researchers looked into it, they were stunned to discover that a man by that very name had indeed lived and died in the house under those exact circumstances. Janet could never have known. Whatever had possessed her was not only real, it had memory, identity, and motive. It didn't just want to be heard, it wanted control, and it had found the perfect host in Janet. By late 1977, the Hodgson home on Green Street had become a magnet for attention. Word had spread fast, first through the neighborhood, then across London, and finally into national headlines. Newspapers like the Daily Mirror sent reporters and photographers to capture the so-called poltergeist, and what they witnessed defied everything they believed possible. Janet had become the center of the storm. Her possession episodes continued to worsen. At times, her body would stiffen mid-step, her eyes glazed, and then she'd collapse in exhaustion. But it was what happened during the nights that truly terrified those who saw it. One evening, during a particularly violent episode, a loud bang shook the house, and Janet screamed from her room. When her mother and a reporter rushed in, they found her lying on top of a tall dresser, completely out of reach for a child to climb in the dark, and with no furniture nearby to assist her ascent. She had no memory of how she got there, but it wasn't just one incident. Soon after, a photographer from the Daily Mirror captured a sequence of images that would make headlines around the world. In them, Janet is seen suspended in mid-air, body arched, arms flailing, as though something had lifted her off the bed and thrown her. The photos were eerie, blurry, and raw, yet undeniably real. Skeptics argued she had jumped, but the images showed no sign of motion, blur, or momentum. No child could have flung themselves so high in that position, without movement, and with that expression of sheer horror on her face. What unsettled witnesses most was the frequency of these levitations. They weren't isolated. Multiple people, including neighbors, reporters, and even a priest, saw Janet float, sometimes slowly, sometimes violently. Once, she was reportedly pulled by her hair across the room, lifted inches off the ground as she screamed in pain. Even more disturbingly, her sister Margaret began to show signs of being affected too. Though not to the same extent, she would often wake with bruises, or find herself in a different position than she remembered falling asleep in. Whatever had taken hold of Janet was growing stronger, and it wasn't content with just one victim. The media frenzy intensified. Photographs of Janet midair made headlines with captions like "The Floating Girl" and "Possessed Child in Enfield." While some dismissed it as trickery, others, especially those who had witnessed the events firsthand, were left shaken. What was happening in that small house on Green Street wasn't a prank. It was something far darker, and it was escalating. The haunting had crossed the threshold. The house wasn't just cursed. It had become a stage for something evil that wanted the world to watch. As the months wore on, the eerie events at the Hodgson house grew, not only in intensity but in complexity. The presence that had once been a single, malevolent force now seemed to invite others. Voices whispered in the night, some friendly, some threatening. Gone. Shadows flickered just beyond sight. It became clear that the haunting was no longer limited to one spirit, but that the house was a crossroads for restless souls. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises not only from the Hodgson's house, but from adjacent properties as well. Children playing nearby would sometimes pause, staring at invisible visitors, whispering of the people in the dark. One chilling night, a neighbor claimed she saw a figure standing at the edge of the garden, a man with no face, wearing tattered clothes, who disappeared when approached. Inside the house, Janet's possession episodes multiplied. The voice of Bill Wilkins remained the dominant force, but sometimes other voices spoke through her: women's voices, children's voices, even faint laughter. At times, multiple voices would speak at once, creating a cacophony of otherworldly sounds. The investigators who had come to document the haunting began to wonder if they were dealing with a poltergeist pack rather than a single entity. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises not only from the Hodgson's house, but from adjacent properties as well. Children playing nearby would sometimes pause, staring at invisible visitors, whispering of the people in the dark. One chilling night, a neighbor claimed she saw a figure standing at the edge of the garden, a man with no face, wearing tattered clothes, who disappeared when approached. Yet, despite the fear, there were moments when the spirit seemed almost sorrowful. Janet, while possessed, once uttered a quiet plea for help, begging the entities to leave us alone. It was as if the ghosts were trapped, angry and desperate, caught in a limbo they could not escape. The Hodgsons were caught in a battle they could neither understand nor control. Their home had become a gateway, a haunted threshold, where the living and the dead crossed paths. And with every passing day, the line between this world and the next grew thinner and more unstable. As the haunting escalated beyond what the Hodgson family could bear, word reached the Society for Psychical Research, a British organization dedicated to studying paranormal phenomena. Two of their most experienced investigators, Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair, arrived at the Green Street house in late 1977, determined to document and understand what was happening. From their very first nights in the house, Maurice and Guy witnessed events that defied explanation. Doors slammed shut with no one near. Heavy furniture moved violently across the rooms. Janet's possession episodes became focal points of their investigations. Using tape recorders, cameras, and notebooks, they meticulously documented every strange noise, every whispered voice, and every levitation. One night, during a particularly intense session, they recorded voices on tape that seemed to come from nowhere. When played back, these voices spoke clearly, responding to their questions and even addressing them by name. The spirit identified himself as Bill Wilkins and recounted details about his life and death that were later verified by historical records. Maurice, who had a deeply scientific and skeptical nature, was forced to confront the unexplainable. He and Guy conducted numerous tests to rule out trickery, fraud, or psychological explanations. Janet was observed constantly. Many events occurred while she was asleep or separated from her siblings. Attempts to provoke the phenomena only seemed to encourage more activity. The investigators also encountered resistance. Objects would be hurled with increased force when they tried to intervene. Lights flickered violently. On several occasions, they were threatened with violent gestures from unseen forces. Despite the danger, Maurice and Guy remained committed. They felt a responsibility to uncover the truth, not just for the Hodgson family, but for the world watching through news reports. Over the months, they amassed hundreds of hours of recordings, photographs, and eyewitness testimonies. Yet, even with all the evidence, the nature of the haunting remained a mystery. Was this a restless spirit seeking peace, a poltergeist feeding off fear, or something darker, beyond human understanding? The Hodgson family was caught in the middle of a supernatural storm, and the investigators were the only line between the unknown and the truth. But the story Bill told was far from peaceful. He spoke of resentment toward those who had disturbed his resting place and toward the living family occupying his home. He claimed the house belonged to him, that he had been wronged in life, and that now, in death, he would not allow anyone to feel safe. Bill told of his final days, describing how he had been blind and alone, sitting in a chair in the house when a sudden brain hemorrhage took his life. The investigators verified these details through local records and interviews with previous residents, confirming that a man named Bill Wilkins had indeed lived and died in the house years earlier. But the story Bill told was far from peaceful. He spoke of resentment toward those who had disturbed his resting place and toward the living family occupying his home. He claimed the house belonged to him, that he had been wronged in life, and that now, in death, he would not allow anyone to feel safe. More than once, the spirit warned the investigators and the family to leave. His tone shifted from sorrow to anger, and the phenomena intensified. Furniture was thrown with greater force. Janet's possession episodes became more violent. Bill's voice was heard calling out threats, cursing those who stayed. Yet, beneath the menace, there was a haunting sadness. On rare occasions, Bill's voice soft, lamenting his isolation and pain. It was as if he was trapped in a limbo, unable to rest or find peace. The investigators faced a profound dilemma: how to help a spirit so deeply tormented that it caused harm to the living, yet seemed beyond redemption. Bill Wilkins was no ordinary ghost. He was a presence with a story, a tragic life, twisted by death into something terrifying. This voice from beyond the grave would shape the course of the haunting and haunt those involved for years to come. The Enfield haunting attracted not only investigators, but all photographers and journalists, eager to capture evidence of the paranormal. Among the many images taken during the months-long investigation, several photographs would become iconic, offering haunting glimpses into the terrifying reality the Hodgson family faced. One of the most famous photos showed Janet mid-levitation, her body suspended several feet above the floor, her arms and legs rigid as if held by invisible hands. The image was blurry yet unmistakable, a stark contradiction to any natural explanation. Skeptics tried to dismiss it as a trick of light or camera manipulation, but the photographer insisted the picture was unaltered, taken in the heat of the moment during a sudden outburst. Other photos captured fleeting shadows and dark shapes lurking in corners or near doorways. In one chilling image, the face of a man, pale, gaunt, and twisted in anger, appeared behind a curtain. Some believe this was the visage of Bill Wilkins himself, frozen in a moment between life and death. Photographs also documented physical damage: a shattered window, a broken chair, and gouges on the walls and floorboards. These were not staged. The investigators and family confirmed they were fresh and unexplained. The Enfield haunting attracted not only investigators, but also photographers and journalists eager to capture evidence of the paranormal. Among the many images taken during the months-long investigation, several photographs would become iconic, offering haunting glimpses into the terrifying reality the Hodgson family faced. The haunting had moved beyond whispered stories and late-night knocks. It was now visible, undeniable, and it left a mark that time would not erase. The most terrifying and unforgettable moments of the Enfield haunting with over several nights, witnesses, neighbors, investigators, reporters saw Janet physically lifted from her bed and suspended in midair. These events were no fleeting illusions. They were prolonged, unmistakable, and horrifying. One night, Janet was found floating horizontally several feet above the floor, her arms spread wide, her body rigid. She appeared unconscious, yet fully suspended. The room was silent except for a labored breathing and the gasps of onlookers. Photographs taken during these episodes showed no sign of support or trickery. The levitations were often violent. Janet would sometimes be thrown from her bed or yanked across the room by an unseen force, leaving bruises and scratches. During these episodes, she was unreachable, her body unresponsive to pleas or touch. Investigators struggled to intervene. They witnessed objects flying around the room, doors slamming, and heavy furniture crashing to the floor, all while Janet floated helplessly. The physical force seemed to grow stronger with each incident, as if the entity feeding on the fear was gaining power. The family's fear deepened, sleep became impossible, and their home turned into a battleground between the living and the unseen. The levitations were the climax of this dark ordeal, a terrifying reminder that some forces are beyond human control. These moments forever haunted those who witnessed them, marking the Enfield Poltergeist as one of the most chilling cases in paranormal history. After months of relentless terror, the Hodgson family faced their most harrowing night yet. It was as if the restless spirit, Bill Wilkins, knew the investigation was nearing its end and had gathered all its remaining strength for a final, furious outburst. On this night, the atmosphere in the house was thick with dread. Cold spots pierced the air, and an oppressive silence preceded each terrifying event. As darkness fell, the pounding began loud, rhythmic knocks echoing through every corner of the house. Furniture was thrown violently, smashing walls and shattering windows. Janet's body was tossed about with increasing violence, her screams tearing through the night. The investigators, neighbors, and police who had stayed close by were frozen in fear, powerless to stop what was unfolding. At one point, Janet was found levitating once more, but this time her body twisted unnaturally, limbs contorted as if caught in a painful struggle. The malevolent force seemed desperate, angry, and uncontrollable. When the lights flickered and died, darkness engulfed the house, and the voice of Bill Wilkins roared through the walls, issuing chilling threats and curses. By dawn, the chaos ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The house fell eerily silent, and the Hodgson family, exhausted and broken, knew that this night marked a turning point. Though the violence diminished afterward, the scars, both physical and the haunting, had left its permanent mark on their lives. But while this was the last night of major activity, the story was far from over. Though the most violent episodes at the Hodgson house finally subsided in 1979, the haunting did not truly end. 4 years afterward, Janet and her family continued to feel the unsettling presence lurking in their lives. Janet spoke openly about ongoing shadows, unexplained noises, and a lingering coldness that followed her, even when far from the house. The investigators Morris Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair maintained contact with the family for decades, recording further incidents and reflections. Morris, in particular, became deeply affected by the case, dedicating much of his life to understanding the phenomena and warning others that some forces may never fully leave. Janet, who had grown up and started her own family, admitted in later interviews that she had faked some of the phenomena, mostly minor tricks to gain attention, but insisted that the majority of the experiences were terrifyingly real. She described feeling a presence that was both malevolent and deeply sad, like a soul trapped in eternal unrest. The Enfield Poltergeist case remains one of the most extensively investigated and documented hauntings in modern history. It challenged skeptics, fascinated believers, and left a lasting impact on paranormal research. To this day, the house at 284 Green Street stands quietly, its walls holding secrets that may never be fully revealed. And for those who lived through it, the haunting was not just a story, it was a terrifying reality that forever blurred the line between the living and the dead. If you found this story chilling and want to uncover more real-life horror mysteries, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Share your thoughts or experiences with the supernatural in the comments below. Have you ever encountered something unexplainable? And don't forget to like and share this story with friends who love true horror stories. Stay curious, stay safe, but beware, some ghosts never rest.